Welcome to Pihu classes. Today we will learn chemoreceptors.
Chemo refers to the chemical composition of the blood. So chemoreceptors are the special nerve cells, or receptors, that sense changes in the chemical composition of the blood. That information is sent from the chemoreceptors to the brain to help keep the cardiovascular and respiratory systems balanced. Alright, according to their location, chemoreceptors can be classified into two types, peripheral and central ones. Now, the peripheral chemoreceptors are so named because they live outside the brain. They are actually tiny bodies, or clusters of nerve cells, and they include the aortic body, which sits along the wall of the aortic arch, and the carotid body, which is located at the point where each common carotid artery splits into the internal and external carotid arteries, running alongside the neck. Both the aortic and carotid bodies are bathed in arterial blood, and they carefully monitor changes in the concentration or partial pressure of oxygen, PO2 for short, but also the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PCO2 for short, as well as the concentration of hydrogen ions, which determines blood pH. The aortic body sends this information along to the vagus, or 10th cranial nerve, and the carotid body sends this information along to the glossopharyngeal, or 9th cranial nerve. These two large nerves travel up towards the respiratory centres, which are in the brainstem. The respiratory centres are groups of neurons located in the pons and the medulla oblongata, and they're responsible for the autonomic or involuntary control of breathing. The respiratory centres also communicate with the cardiovascular centres. The cardiovascular centres are areas in the lower one-third of the pons and medulla oblongata of the brainstem, responsible for autonomic or involuntary control of the cardiac and vascular function. They do that by coordinating the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. Now, there are two main cardiovascular centres. The first is the vasomotor control centre, which controls the diameter of blood vessels using sympathetic nerve fibres to cause vasoconstriction. The second is the cardiac control centre, which is further divided into the cardiac accelerator and the cardiac decelerator centres. The cardiac accelerator centre speeds up the heart rate and increases the cardiac contractility through the sympathetic outflow tract, while the cardiac decelerator centre slows down the heart rate through the parasympathetic outflow tract. Notice that both the sympathetic and parasympathetic system affect the heart rate, but only the sympathetic system has an effect on the diameter of the blood vessels and the contractility of the heart muscle. Okay, so let's say that you have hypoxemia, meaning a decrease in the arterial partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, along with hypercapnia, an increase in the arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, and acidemia, a decrease in blood pH. As blood pulses through the aortic arch and the common carotid, these changes get detected by the aortic and carotid bodies, which start firing more nerve impulses up through the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves towards the cardiovascular centres of the brainstem. In response, the vasomotor centre increases the vasoconstrictive effect of the sympathetic nervous system, causing arterioles to narrow, raising the total peripheral arterial resistance. In addition, the vasomotor centre limits blood flow to the peripheral organs, like the muscles, to help conserve oxygen for the brain and heart. It also decreases the metabolic rate to help reduce carbon dioxide production. There's also increased constriction of veins, which returns more blood to the heart rather than allowing it to pool in the periphery. Increased venous return means there's more preload, and that also increases cardiac output. Now, another effect is that the cardiac accelerator centre gets inhibited, reducing the sympathetic effect on the heart, so that it can work slower and less forcefully. In other words, decreasing the heart rate and contractility. While the cardiac decelerator centre is activated, boosting the parasympathetic effects of the heart, which again slows the heart rate. This last bit might sound a bit counterintuitive, but stay tuned. Now, it turns out that peripheral chemoreceptors also send impulses through the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves, which reaches the respiratory centres in the brainstem. And they cause you to suck in more oxygen and blow off more carbon dioxide by getting the diaphragm and the chest wall muscles to breathe faster and deeper. Now, this causes airways to get stretched, and that's detected by another type of receptor called the pulmonary stretch receptor. And these are located in the smooth muscles lining the trachea and central bronchi. Once stretched, these receptors start firing through the vagus nerve back to the pons and medulla, where they tell the respiratory centres to slow down. At the same time, though, they stimulate the cardiac accelerator centre, and so the sympathetic effect on the heart is increased, and this makes the heart rate and the contractility increase. All the while, the cardiac decelerator centre is inhibited, and thus the parasympathetic effect on the heart, which again helps the heart rate to speed up. In other words, they reverse the direct effect that the peripheral chemoreceptors had on the cardiac centres. Ultimately, this makes the heart work faster and stronger, letting the cardiac output, CO, and blood pressure, BP, rise. This is essential to push more blood to the lungs so that it can get supplied with oxygen and freed from excess carbon dioxide. Now, peripheral chemoreceptors work in concert with the central chemoreceptors, which take their name from the fact that they're part of the central nervous system, particularly the brain. Central chemoreceptors are clusters of neurons packed together in the ventral or frontal surface of the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain, right next to the respiratory centres themselves. The central chemoreceptors are bathed in cerebrospinal fluid, and they sample the fluid to assess for changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, and pH. That's different from the peripheral chemoreceptors, which are primarily sensitive to changes in the partial pressure of oxygen, or PO2. When the partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises in the blood, carbon dioxide molecules rapidly diffuse across the blood-brain barrier and build up in the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is mainly composed of water, so carbon dioxide binds to water molecules to form carbonic acid, H2CO3, and that rapidly breaks down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. As hydrogen ions build up too, the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid starts to drop. So both the increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the decreased pH together trigger the central chemoreceptors to stimulate the nearby respiratory centres to increase the respiratory drive. Now, what makes the central chemoreceptors special is that, due to their location, they are also influenced by changes in the blood flow to the brain. Imagine, for example, that there's a large mass inside the head which raises the intracranial pressure, squashing the blood vessels heading in and out of the brain and causing brain ischemia. This means that all of the carbon dioxide that gets released by the brain cells as a byproduct of their metabolic processes can't escape through blood flow. So inevitably it starts accumulating in the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, also decreasing its pH. Once again, this gets detected by the central chemoreceptors, which, via the vasomotor centre, leads to an arteriolar and venous constriction, redirecting more blood flow to the brain. That increases the total peripheral resistance, TPR, which raises the blood pressure, BP, helping the blood pressure to stay higher than the cerebrospinal fluid pressure so that blood can continue to flow to the brain. This increase in blood pressure in response to increased intracranial pressure is called the Cushing reaction, named after the neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing. Alright, so as a quick recap, peripheral chemoreceptors include the aortic and carotid bodies, which respond primarily to decreases in the partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, and secondarily to increases in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, PCO2, and decreases in blood pH, sending information through the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the vasomotor and cardiac centres of the pons and medulla. These, in turn, through sympathetic stimulation, increase total peripheral resistance and cardiac output, raising blood pressure. Central chemoreceptors are found in the medulla and are more sensitive to increases in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and decreases in pH, which, again, through the vasomotor centre, stimulates sympathetic vasoconstriction, raising blood pressure.
Thank you.